there are some moths that we don't even know what their caterpillar looks like. It's like when you turn on your lamp or your porch light at home, and you've got these little tiny brown speck moths sticking on your porch wall. To me, that really blew my mind, that these things that we think of as so mundane are actually unknown and might be unknowable in a way.
Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast. I'm your host, Scott Miller. Let's create a cooler world. Welcome. Our guest today is Ben Heuser. Ben is a lifelong resident of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and describes himself as a lifelong fan of outdoor activities. After graduating from college with a degree in environmental science, Ben completed an internship as a prairie restoration technician with the Nature Conservancy. Ben then returned to Chapel Hill to begin his current job as Natural Areas Steward for the North Carolina Botanical Garden. As part of the garden's conservation team, Ben helps care for natural areas including Battle Park and the Piedmont Nature Trails. So Ben, thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I've never been on a podcast before, so grateful for the opportunity.
Yeah, cool. Glad this is your first one. So you are a Natural Areas Steward at the North Carolina Botanical Garden. Is that correct?
Yeah, nail on the head.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and what you do?
Totally. I've got a little spiel that I do, and I always start with the bigger picture. But the North Carolina Botanical Garden is located in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and we, obviously, as the name entails, we have a 12-acre display garden just south of the campus of UNC Chapel Hill. But we also serve as a broader conservation organization. So the Botanical Garden manages or oversees around 1,200 acres of natural areas. And around 800 of those are managed actively, which is to say that we don't just oversee them to see that nothing changes. We're out there working every day in the natural areas to achieve our mission of maximizing supporting plant diversity and local ecology and local relationships to that stuff. So my particular role as natural area stewards, I work with these natural areas, and it does entail a ton of different things, which is, in my opinion, pretty cool. One day I could be working with invasive plant removal. Other days leading a volunteer trail work day, or working with a UNC class, sort of an educational outreach. So there's a lot of variety into what I get to do, but all of it is, for the goal of kind of supporting local ecology, both physically and when it comes to people's relationships with it.
Cool. And you also help take care of Battle Park and the Piedmont Nature Trails. Is that correct?
Yeah. So those are some of the natural areas that the garden manages. They're almost all in Orange County and almost all right there in Chapel Hill. So the Battle Park and the Piedmont Nature Trails are my most significant areas of management.
And so for some of our listeners who might be familiar with Chapel Hill, maybe UNC students, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill students, may be familiar with the Forest Theater, which I love the Forest Theater, but I would love you to tell people a little bit about the Forest Theater. What's that all about?
Yeah, the Forest Theater originated as literally a forest theater. In the 1920s, there was sort of a wave of interest in outdoor theater. And so the Forest Theater was the UNC theater scene's response to that increased interest. So originally it was just a clearing and a hill for the seating, and over time, throughout the 30s and 40s, the Works Progress Administration has evolved into a kind of a classically styled stone theater that's right in the middle of campus, and it's publicly accessible, which I think is a really cool aspect of the space. That often I'll show up to work and there's someone playing guitar on the stage, or people sitting and reading. It feels very alive. The kind of main event is the Paper Hand Puppets intervention, which happens late summer to early fall every year. Sort of a high concept puppet show. They're based out of Pittsboro, North Carolina. Usually explore these environmental themes. And when I say puppets, I'm talking about 20 feet tall, operated by 4 or 5 people. So it's not hand puppets. It's really a magical thing.
Yeah, and the Forest Theater is, you talked about this like classic stone theater. I mean, it looks like you're walking into a little castle, or like what you would expect a theater to be if you went to a theater in a medieval castle, like something out of Game of Thrones, right? It's like the perfect place for the Paper Hand Puppet Show or any kind of like really cool outdoor event. And Battle Park is the natural trails and park that surrounds the Forest Theater. I mean, how big is Battle Park?
Battle Park is around 95 acres, which is, I think, is pretty remarkable to have in the middle of a university town, a really quickly growing town, to have like a natural space of that size. And another thing that's really significant about Battle Park is that, at least as far as kind of European records go, we know that Battle Park hasn't been farmed or hasn't been totally logged. So there's like a lot of natural age there, which is a really, really incredible thing, especially, here on the East Coast, where not that long ago, every square inch that you could farm was a field of some kind.
So I think Battle Park is so cool because it is like pretty much right there on the campus of UNC, like, not far from the large UNC hospital complex and the stadium and everything, and just that cool natural space that you can go and take a walk through and enjoy these trails. And then the Piedmont Nature Trails are really awesome too. That's closer to the actual, what people know of as the North Carolina Botanical Garden, the display garden. But just off to the side there, there's this large trail complex, and up and down hills and through the woods, and just a really awesome place to take a hike. I don't know how much it's known, how well it's known, like just how many students and faculty like take advantage of these places and, go for hikes on a regular basis. I mean, I know sometimes I go there and it seems kind of busy, and other times there's very few people. Does it tend to get a lot of traffic? Do these places tend to get a lot of traffic?
That's a good question. One that I wish we had maybe more resources to explore. I don't know how comparable organizations, or what the best way to track trail traffic is, really. It's not like there's a doorway that you go in and out. But I would say variably used. I think we've got a lot of neighbors, people who use the space a lot. But I do, especially when I'm dealing with university folks, professors and students, a lot of times, if I'm meeting them there, they'll be there for the first time. So I think a surprising amount of people don't know or have never been to these natural areas that are right here in Chapel Hill.
And you are a lifelong Chapel Hill resident. I think especially anybody who is maybe a basketball fan, is probably familiar with Chapel Hill and the University of North Carolina. What was it like growing up in Chapel Hill, like growing up there all your life?
Well, I didn't grow up anywhere else, so I can't necessarily do a comparative response. But I think that Chapel Hill was a really great place to grow up. Again, this is, I'm speaking from my exact experience, so I don't know what other experiences are like, but it felt like the right size of place that was small enough that I kind of felt like I felt like I understood it, and felt like I was, part of a community. But large enough that, there's a lot of, being a kind of a college town, there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of things that happen here that were really cool to participate in. And as a kid, I performed once at the Forest Theater when I was in third or fourth grade for a school play. And it's funny to me now that I know exactly who, the principal and my teachers were emailing with to get those reservations in that space, because they're still my coworkers.
Oh, that's cool. That's fun. Yeah, I mean, I joke around about living here for a while now in this area. I joke around about basketball a lot, but really, it is a cool area because there's so much amazing research that goes on, like science and research, medical research, just really amazing things that are happening in this area, that have come out of this area, continue to come out of this area. So you talk about that energy and the kind of a place it is to live. And yeah, it's definitely fun.
Can I ask how long you've been in the Triangle, Scott?
Yeah, sure. I actually moved here in 2006.
Okay. All right, I got you beat by 1 year. I was born in Chicago and I moved to Chapel Hill in 2005. But we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, cool. And you've told me that you're a lifelong fan of outdoor activities. Tell us about that a little bit. What kind of outdoor activities have you been involved in or interested in?
Yeah, in college, as a freshman, went on I went to Davidson College, went on their sort of outdoor orientation trip. So we spent 3 days backpacking on the Appalachian Trail with a group of 8 other incoming first years as, a way to form community and build bonds. And I guess maybe not quite lifelong, but very, very strong spike in the last few years. That really lit a fire with me to just creating a relationship with the outdoors, outdoor activities and nature as well, which I think have kind of some different elements. And that for me throughout college, that manifested into becoming a part of that outdoor leadership program, taking other students hiking and rock climbing. And those are just activities that make up a lot of my interests and stuff that I've continued since then.
So as far as the job that you have now, working at the Botanical Garden, doing conservation work, when did you become interested in that? When did you decide that was a path that you were going to pursue? How'd that come about?
I studied environmental science at a university in college, and that was it was a small school, small program, so it was really broad. I was able to study geology and kind of environmental humanities at the same semesters. So I didn't necessarily specialize into conservation or anything like that at that point. When I graduated college, I said I want to be outside for a while, stop writing papers. So I applied to a ton of fieldwork internships and ended up living in rural west central Minnesota with an internship with the Nature Conservancy, which if there are any St. Cloud area, Minnesota folks out there, just give me a shout out. It's a beautiful area of the world.
So it sounds like this was maybe driven by just a desire to be outside. Like that's the kind of work you're thinking. That's the kind of work I want to do. I want to do work where I'm outside, enjoy the outdoors, and that kind of led you to this field or this particular pursuit.
Yeah, that's funny that you'd say that. I think I really envisioned, like, okay, I'll do this internship. It was for 6 months, since most field internships are time limited because once the winter hits, especially in Minnesota, and if you're working with plants, there's a lot less to do once everything turns brown and goes dormant for the year. But I was kind of envisioning that as, okay, I'll do this outside job for 6 months, and the internship will end, and then I'll get a real job. But was sort of a bug that bit me. So hearing about this position through kind of word of mouth, the idea of being able to continue working with plants specifically and in these natural areas, then also being in my hometown, were all really appealing things to me. But I did definitely kind of develop a love for plants and working with plants in that position. The duties of it was on the restoration team. And so our 9 to 5 or our 7 to 5, because we worked 10-hour days, was we would go to different nature preserves, federal preserves, state hunting lands, and then nonprofit nature conservancy preserves, and we would hunt down wildflower seeds primarily, hunt down seed material from all of these native plants to be used in restorations. And tallgrass prairies are just incredibly, incredibly diverse when it comes to types and species of plants. So going from never really having worked with plants before to being able to differentiate identical looking asters by the way that their leaves clasp the stem or don't do that. That was a really powerful experience for me, and that really set me on a track to do more of that work.
So when you talk about restoration, can you talk about that a little more for people who might not be familiar with that kind of work?
Yeah. So restoration work, in the case of Minnesota, used to be that tallgrass prairie ecosystem made up really almost half of the state. And today, what remains is less than 1% of the original, because the tallgrass prairie, or grasslands in general, developed this fantastic soil from all of the organic elements dying and decaying. And without trees, it's really suited to farming. So when European people got there, a lot of German immigrants in the 1800s, it was kind of like jackpot, like this great soil for farming, and they didn't have the same understanding or appreciation of those natural systems that we do today, I suppose. But in short, the restoration work was to help restore these natural processes, these cycles of biotic and abiotic activity that would be occurring in a tallgrass prairie if it had been existing uninterrupted since the 1800s. And so that a lot of that was old farmland that was being seeded and reintroducing prescribed fire, so that the plants that once were able to thrive there could thrive there again. And with the plants and with these management changes, the wildlife and the insects and the fungi and all those things that we think about are a little harder to pin down. But restoration work is, I think a lot of ways just the process of making things like how they used to be naturally.
That's such a common story, right? In human experience is people show up somewhere and find this resource and say, wow, this is great. Like, look at this fantastic farmland. And then they just start planting and planting and planting and planting without understanding that the reason that this place is the way it is because of these natural cycles, right? These natural processes that have been going on for so long, for centuries and, thousands of years. And then when you disrupt those natural processes, all of a sudden, those great resources are no longer going to be as great and as productive, at least not forever, right? You can get away with it for a while, but then it's like, well, what are we going to do now? So you're doing this restoration work to try to restore some of this prairie land to its natural state.
I was going to say, I really like that idea of the natural processes and natural resources, how they fit into one another. I think a lot about pictures of when the like Pacific Northwest was being logged for the first time. Just pictures of guys standing next to these 6-foot diameter sequoia trees that they would cut down 20 a day of. Just the idea of all those being made into axe handles and, cartwheels, I guess, is pretty shocking to me. But if you were a person of that time, it would really be like, this incredible gift. But the idea of stewardship wasn't there like it is today.
Yeah, like stewardship, taking care of these natural resources and preserving them so that they can continue to serve not just us, but, future generations too, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's important.
Yeah, definitely. I think natural resources and environmental science might be sort of two different fields in a sense, with a lot of overlap. But I think that those two fields aren't, maybe don't need to be separated as much. For me, ecology is all about all of these really inscrutable and unknowable connections between things. I think we're just now kind of gaining an understanding of how the relationship between mycelium and fungi and trees, that all of these things that evolved over billions of years are interacting with each other in ways that maybe science hasn't quite caught up with. And without knowing about those interactions, the best thing we can do is to create a space where they can happen uninterrupted. I think that's what about stewardship means to me.
Yeah, that's, I think, the aspect of things that maybe a lot of people aren't aware of or don't talk about as much, but the fact that there's just so much we don't know, right? Like, we live in this technologically, scientifically immersed society, and yet there's so much we don't know, including about the natural world. So there's so much value in like keeping some things the way they are, letting them, live in their natural state uninterrupted until we get to a point where maybe we can understand those things better. Ben just mentioned mycelia. And if you've never heard that word before, or you've heard it, but you don't know what it means, mycelia are basically the roots of mushrooms in very simple layman's terms. So mycelia are really cool and interesting, and we'll include some links in the show notes to information about mycelia in case you want to go down that rabbit hole.
I'm kind of doubtful that what we think of as science will ever get to the point where we're able to draw this web, kind of like a food web, like you draw in biology class and in high school. All these interactions of eating, to be able to draw that relationship web between all of the fungi and the microbes and the insects and the herbivores and the predators. Just that I think that forever some aspect of this behavior will remain unknowable. And my favorite example of an unknown in the natural world is at the Cullowhee Native Plant Conference I was able to attend last year. Native Plant Conference, sort of the big show about native plants in the Southeast, takes place in Cullowhee, North Carolina. Happens every summer, but I was able to attended a moth workshop. So we went out at night with lights and screens and attracted moths and tried to identify them. And one thing that the presenter, entomologist, brought up was that there are some moths that we don't even know what their caterpillar looks like. It's like when you turn on your lamp or your porch light at home and you've got these little tiny brown speck moths sticking on your porch wall. That every one of those is a different, so many of those are different species, and to think that they have a whole life cycle, a caterpillar, and they might have a specific host plant. To me, that really blew my mind, that these things that we think of as so mundane are actually unknown and might be unknowable in a way.
Wow. So these, a lot of moths, like, scientists know what the caterpillar looks like, and you're saying there are a lot of them that we actually don't know. We have no idea where these things come from. Is that what you're saying?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And these are the things that are just like hanging out on our back porch every day, right? Wow. That's interesting. I was going to ask you a question like that, like what's some cool fact that you've learned maybe about native species here in North Carolina? My favorite thing that I learned fairly recently in life, is about the Venus flytrap. So, the carnivorous plant, the Venus flytrap. I'm sure people can picture what this looks like. We'll include a picture if you can't. But, you see this plant that like eats insects. And, at some point, I'm sure when I was younger, I thought, oh, this thing must grow like in the middle of Africa or like on Skull Island in the South Pacific or something, right?
Yeah.
No,
King Kong.
It is native to North Carolina. A small area around Wilmington, North Carolina is where these plants are native to.
Right, native to North Carolina and almost exclusively native to North Carolina, somewhat into South Carolina, but right here, a lot of people think of North Carolina as being a pretty normal place, but not totally.
Yeah, it's got little exotic elements. So your work carries you from prairie restoration with the Nature Conservancy. You hear about this opportunity back here in Chapel Hill with the Botanical Garden. Now you're back here. Let's talk a little bit about like native species and the importance of preserving native species. Because I'm sure a lot of people, if you have a yard and you plant plants and, there are just a lot of people in the world and in our country who are just going to plant whatever looks pretty. And that's not necessarily an awesome thing to do. So, can you talk a little bit more about that, maybe for a layperson who might not be familiar with why native species are so important and some of the problems with invasive species? What are some of the important things for people to know?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I would start off with sort of the definition of native species, which when I say native species, I think native plants especially, I would refer to the plants that more or less evolved to be here. So you think of, the millions, billions years of progress of life from single cellular organisms and algae and slime out of the primordial soup is the word I was looking for. Out of the primordial soup into what we see today: oak trees and honeysuckle vines and just the incredible nature that surrounds us. So the native plants that have evolved to be here in the Piedmont of North Carolina over billions of years have honed these environmental conditions and these biological conditions, the fungi and the bacteria that are here. And they've just fit perfectly into this niche that comes with sort of this geographical element. They over a billion years have just evolved to live here. And when it comes to, like to throw back to this concept of interconnectedness, or like these webs that I was talking about. So these plants aren't growing in a vacuum, aren't evolving in a vacuum. If you think about Venus flytraps, why do they eat bugs when most other plants don't? And the answer is because they grow in these bogs, these in areas of the coastal plain where the soil is not very good when it comes to what a plant needs, and so they obtain their nutrients by predating insects. So the idea that these plants evolved over eons to be a product of their larger systems, biological, chemical, geographical, and all of these interactions with other plants and fungi and insects and mammals and reptiles. So they just fit perfectly into this web of relationships that has been going on in progress since time immemorial. So that is a long-winded explanation of what I think about when I say native plants.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can relate to the idea of like a polar bear. You see a polar bear, and this looks like an animal that has evolved to survive in a very cold, snowy, icy environment, right? It's got the thick white fur and everything, right? But then you walk around outside and you see all these very normal looking plants and trees and grasses that grow in the area where you live. And literally those ordinary looking plants and trees and grasses have done the same thing. They've evolved to survive and thrive in this specific area, right? Wherever it is that they are. And not only that, you're talking about this whole web of interconnectedness. Like these plants are also helping to support insects and animals and, the whole collection of life that you see when you walk out your front door. I mean, these have adapted or, evolved to survive right there in that space and depend on each other. Am I getting that right? Am I getting the science right here?
Yeah, that's really well put, I think. The idea that, just the mundane things that are around us, the landscaping trees and the flowers in our neighbor's lawn, that those have impacts beyond our human impact, that more than just looking pretty. And for me, native plants, especially in like a gardening context, are all about the idea of being a part of that system and a lot of that for me is the idea of these systems, these interactions of being kind of unknowable. Like I don't know what eats the seeds of any given flower that you might plant in your garden. All of these interactions of species that are just so complex that even the modern science of ecology can't fully describe them. So the idea that native plants are building into this and supporting this system that is just so complex and has existed forever. And the idea of that being, just better for all parts of that system. That system is what supports, the way, what people call ecosystem services. Water filtration, water, air production of photosynthetic plants, pollination of crops, just all of these things that we take for granted from the natural world are bolstered by these mundane and kind of inscrutable interactions between plants and animals and everything else.
Yeah, you mentioned pollination, which, maybe people are becoming aware is really important. We rely on that for all the beautiful flowers around us, but also for our food, right? These pollinators. And, of course, like bees are important and people are maybe familiar with honeybees and with bumblebees, but there are all these so many other species of bees that are out there that we hardly ever notice, but are playing a really important role in the natural world and our food production and everything. And we talked a little bit about it, invasive species. Just so people, for anybody who's not familiar with some of these terms, what would we mean if we're talking about invasive species?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. Invasive species being in the plainest language, a species that comes from somewhere else and causes a problem. If you think about these long-term evolutionary networks and systems of relationships, in general, were contained to the continents. That things in North Carolina might have relationships with things in eastern North Carolina, and things in central North Carolina might have had less of a relationship between things in South Carolina. But when it came to things from North Africa or China, that there were really no overlap between these plant species, because why would there be? Because they're separated by 1,000 miles of ocean, until the Columbian Exchange and the exchange of all of these plants from one place to another. And so many plants, a lot of common gardening plants aren't native, but a lot of them aren't invasive either. So invasive plants come from when a plant is introduced from a different place, and it's able to not just survive, but also persist and spread. That's a big factor. That's able to not just maintain a population, but to procreate beyond the sort of original introduction source, and then have what we'd think about as an impact. So that might be something like the emerald ash borer, which is a wood-boring beetle that I don't know where the emerald ash borer originates, but from outside of the Americas, and it's taking a liking to the East Coast's ash trees, and it's able to totally eliminate or kill these individual ash trees and spread fairly rapidly, sort of like these European diseases were introduced to native indigenous people who didn't have a resistance to them. Those diseases really decimated these indigenous populations, similarly to how ash trees, they just don't have a resistance. The evolutionary history isn't there, so this insect is able to predate them extremely effectively. So that's an example of a negative impact that invasive species could have as well. And a lot of times it's just taking up space, that they're able to colonize areas and outcompete native species and form their own little monoculture, preventing other species from growing there. That's another thing we think of as an impact. So a lot of these different negative impacts can arise from invasive species, but not all non-native plants are invasive, and I think that's important to keep in mind.
What would be an example, let's say, of a non-native plant that people might know of that's not considered invasive?
It's still a little bit ongoing, but I think of crepe myrtle trees as a non-invasive, non-native. Those are the trees, they've got a lot of different stems and kind of papery bark, and they've got these great, beautiful, or little beautiful flowers in the spring. They're pretty common landscaping plants, just sitting in parking lots and yards. But in my experience, I've never found a crepe myrtle that's been able to spread seed into the forests that I work in. If they haven't, from my experience, they haven't been successful in procreating outside of being grown in greenhouses. They can't spread on their own. Though I have heard a couple accounts of them, or of spreading without human assistance. So that might not be the best example. Maybe a better example might be wheat. Wheat wasn't native to the U.S. That's a European crop. But you don't think of wheat as spreading into the forests and crowding out other species just because it's a food crop. You need to kind of work with it to keep it alive, to harvest it, or it'll die. So that's a species that's not from here, but it doesn't have this invasive viral element to it.
Yeah, we don't see, vast patches of wheat by the roadside taking over everything like the kudzu, right? Crepe myrtles, that's interesting to me. I didn't know that about crepe myrtles, that they didn't spread that easily. I think of crepe myrtles as like these really beautiful trees that are just lovely until you want to get rid of one. And then they are the zombie trees, and they just want to keep coming back. And they keep coming back, and they keep coming back. Like it's like watching the waves of zombies arise in the zombie movies. Lauren's going to hate that. My wife's going to hate that. She's going to listen to this. She doesn't like zombies.
Lauren's in favor of native landscaping, which wouldn't include crepe myrtles anyway.
Yeah. And don't get her started on Bradford pears. Just do not get her started on Bradford pears.
Now that's an invasive landscaping plant. Pretty nasty stuff.
I'm kind of thinking that maybe some people listening to this episode might maybe not know a lot about these topics, and maybe there's somebody who has a house and they're thinking about planting, or, they're living in an apartment complex and maybe they can bring some things to the attention of the apartment management or the place where they work. Or I'm just thinking of like the average person who, for whatever reason, decides to flip on this crazy podcast where we're talking about conservation and invasive species and stuff. Like, what are some of the things that you think it's useful for just the average person to know, somebody who's not, really, I want to say plant nerd. Is that offensive if I say plant nerd?
No, I think that us fellow plant nerds would embrace that.
I think my wife would be okay if I called her a plant nerd. So somebody who's not a plant nerd, they're listening to this podcast episode. What are some of the really useful things for people to know just about some of these topics we're talking about?
That's a really good question, because the average person doesn't have huge tracts of land that they can manage for local plant biodiversity, and so that as an individual in the society, I think it's great to think about ways that you can fit into this or support this local ecology, these local systems, while in the situation that you're in. And I think really the best thing you can do, or one way conservation really struggles, is that a lot of people just don't give a damn. They just don't know, and if they do know, they might not care so much. And so being just aware of what local ecology provides for us as people, and thinking about what local ecology supports in the non-human living world, just being aware and vocal of that is really powerful, I think. I've had a number of people in the past year ask me what my least favorite invasive species is. And, I think if you went back not so long ago, that wouldn't be like a sample topic of conversation. So I think things are drifting in the right way, that people are getting aware of these ecological issues, and even just that awareness and how that translates into change at the local level. That's just being aware and being vocal and being excited about plants is that much a very fantastic thing to do.
Yeah, I'm thinking of things like just even learning where some of the natural spaces are in your local area and getting out and enjoying them, right? Because I think it's easy to underestimate how important certain things are if we don't actually experience them ourselves, right? And I mean, I think there's some research I've seen showing that there are various health benefits that are associated possibly with spending time outdoors, physical benefits, mental health benefits, just spending a little bit of time outdoors on a regular basis. So, learning about the places in your area. I mean, like, how many UNC students maybe have never taken a walk through Battle Park? How many students have never gone on a little hike through the Piedmont nature trails, and how many other places are there, cities, towns, colleges, universities around that have these natural places that people have never taken the time to enjoy. And, a lot of people, I think these days struggle with stress and depression and, just the everyday life, right, can be hard sometimes. And
definitely
giving yourself some time to get outdoors and enjoy some of the spaces that are, it seems like there'd be a lot of opportunities there that people could take advantage of.
Yeah. I am, as I feel like I have been, going to harken back to this idea of relationships and the idea of us as people not being a part of that web of relationships is sort of silly. I think that even if we're not interacting with the natural world, like a tree that lives outside every day of its life because it's living in the ground, it can't be anywhere else. But that thinking about people as part of nature was, for me, a really cool thought shift. The idea that we're not separate from these systems, and you feel good for a reason when you've spent time in nature, because I think in part that of this evolutionary history that you go back 300, 400 years, that the people who are your ancestors, they would have been spending a lot more time outside. They would have been interacting with these natural systems. The idea that your brain is really wired to be in those environments, and that's where I think a lot of that pleasure and sort of satisfaction and senses of rightness come from spending time outdoors.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's something that we don't often consider. It is important because a lot of people, I think one of the things that people often struggle with these days is just feeling isolated, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are like, hey, I don't see my friends as much anymore, or, yeah, I mean, a lot of different situations people get in. And, being outdoors and getting that sense for how we are a part of something so much bigger, we are connected to it and we're a part of it. And it's a part of us. That sense that you get. And I think being around people who spend a lot of time outdoors, it's one of the really cool things is they seem to have that sense of that. There's that sense of their place in this much, much bigger world, in this wonderful world that we live in, right? And that connection with it is kind of a really cool benefit.
Yeah, I think that's often true. Some people say like we're all just monkeys on a spinning rock in the middle of space, and I don't really like that idea in a sense because I think it diminishes what relationships that we have with each other and the whole world. But it does, being in nature does really help put things into perspective that, all of these human systems are just constructed, and at its root that we're just one of these organisms in this place that didn't have to happen, that just pretty largely happened because of all these little interactions adding up over time.
You talked about some of these classes that you work with, some educational outreach that you do. What are some of the groups of students from UNC that you work with?
One of our partnerships is actually with it's a first-year writing class. They kind of sort of a technical writing class where they studied different types of writing, and the unit that we're involved in is scientific narratives. So being able to take these kind of technical scientific concepts and translate them into like a broader narrative that people can engage with. So the last couple semesters, that's taken the form of the invasive and native species sort of paradigm and issue. So I've been taking this class out into Battle Park and just showing examples of native species and showing folks how this holly, the genus Ilex, is native to North Carolina, and this holly in the genus Ilex is native to China, and they're so closely related, but they're different, and they both exist here and then exist and interact with the environment in different ways. It's cool to talk about here, but then of course working with plants, there's so many physical elements that are really, really best explored through speech, in person. But that's been a really cool opportunity to work with, like not even a botany or ecology class, but just a writing class to be able to talk about this story.
In your interactions with different student groups, with groups of volunteers, maybe visitors to the garden that you've worked with, have you ever seen anybody kind of have just a really cool experience or really aha moment where they kind of had a maybe different view suddenly, or appreciation or realization of, anything relating to this work of conservation work or nature? It's any cool experiences that you've seen people have, or anything that comes to mind when I ask about that?
Oh, that's a really good question. One thing that I do on tour is often, this might be taking too much credit, but when I've been working with invasive species, if I come across a particularly big example, especially if they're a woody plant like a Chinese wisteria vine or an English ivy vine, after I take care of the plant itself, I'll take a cutting or like a slice of this woody plant with me, a slice of the trunk, and then it's been cool. It's a pretty good party trick or tour trick, I guess, but to be able to point out this little sprig of Chinese wisteria in Battle Park, it's a foot tall, it's as wide around as, not even as thick as a pencil, and to be able to pull out this disc, the size of let's say a pretty big coffee mug, that diameter, and say that in a couple of years you can count the rings on this little sprout might become a vine this big. Kind of being able to communicate time, which is difficult. The time between when a plant is a seed and when a plant is a huge mature organism, to be able to communicate the end result of these processes to people. That seems to have an effect, which is, I think, cool, because you're visiting these spaces at one point in time, and unless you're able to spend as much time in them as I do, which is very, very few people, it's hard to get a sense of scale as to all of these processes that are happening around us, and what this place might look like in 10 years or 5 years, or what it looked like 10 or 100 years ago. Studying geomorphology in college, I would sometimes kind of get a little mad at the idea that I would never be able to see a glacier carve a glacial valley through a mountain range, or never to be able to see, can only imagine what the Grand Canyon looked like 80 million years ago. But we're really just, here at one point in time, and just got to make the most of it.
Ben, I am very, very grateful for your time today. Thank you for coming on the podcast. Before we go, two things. First of all, do you have any personal projects, social media links, maybe, or just links to the garden? Anything you'd like to share with people that you'd like people to know about?
I would say maybe a link to the Piedmont Nature Trails website. If the reach that this has is outreach for these local natural areas in Chapel Hill, I'd be very happy for that.
Okay, cool. If you are in this area, if you're in the Chapel Hill area, whether you're visiting or you're living here, going to school here, take some time to learn about some of these natural areas and get out and explore them. I would also like to ask you a question that I always ask people when I'm recording a podcast episode. Been asking this question for a while now, and I'm going to ask you, what is your dream right now?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say that one of my dreams might be to see people live. This might be kind of obvious based on the last hour, but to live more with more understanding of where they exist in the world, whether that's geographically or naturally. But to me, the power that comes with being able to be in the natural world and to tell the difference between a cherry bark oak and a white oak and a southern red oak just makes me feel so grounded and so appreciative and so protective of the world that we live in. And as the point of the podcast is that the world is in constant flux, and its global climate change isn't a good flux in many ways, for people certainly, but then also for plants. With global climate change comes regional climate change. I understand the Southeast is to get forecast to become hotter and wetter over time in general, the climatic shift. And so all of these plants that have, been evolving at this natural pace, a lot of them will be able to keep up with this human pace of human anthropogenic climate change, but many of them won't. And extinction is forever, and the Earth, and I think life on Earth will always be here, but the life that is here now isn't a given. And I think it's my dream for a lot of people to hold that firmly in their minds. Many do, and then many others also haven't yet been taught to do that.
That's a great dream. Well, thank you again, Ben. It was really great having you here. Really great hearing you share all this information and all these ideas you have, these thoughts you have about being out in the natural world and our place in it.
Yeah, it was a real privilege. Thank you, Scott.
You can find a link to the website for the Piedmont Nature Trails in the show notes for this episode. If you're in or near Chapel Hill, it really is a lovely place to go for a hike. I've lived in a lot of different places during my life, and in most of those places, there have been beautiful natural spaces to explore and enjoy. So if you haven't done so already, I encourage you to find one of those natural places near you and go explore it. Even if you just go for a short walk or you spend a few minutes out in a natural space, sitting quietly, watching and listening, you might be surprised at what that can do for you. If you're saying, I would love to, but I don't have time, then I invite you to join us for one of the free 1-hour online time management workshops that I run each month. We can't add more hours to a day, but we can change how we use the time that we have. Go to my website, scottmillercoaching.com, and sign up for our next Task Time Energy workshop. I'd love to see you there. I know you're waiting for the dog update, aren't you? Lauren and I took the dogs to Battle Park this past weekend, and they are still talking about it. They keep asking when we can go back, if we're going to see deer again next time we go. Okay, so dogs don't actually speak English, but if they did, ours would probably be asking to go for a hike in the woods every day. So many smells. That's it, folks. That's all we got. Take care.